Hello, I'm Bob McEwen. Welcome to the Fifth Estate. Every year they come here to the hill country of Nepal, climbers drawn by the lure of the Himalayas and by one mountain in particular, Everest, tallest in the world, the highest point on the face of the earth. Even 6 decades after it first was climbed by Edmund, Hillary, and Tenzing Norgay, to reach the summit of Everest is still an astonishingly difficult and dangerous pursuit. On this edition of the Fifth Estate, the story of one Canadian woman driven by her dream to stand as close as possible to the sun. It's a story of life and death, of the strength of the human spirit, and of 2 of the worst days in the history of the world's most legendary and notorious mountain. The reality of Mount Everest is almost impossible to comprehend. As high as the flight path of an intercontinental jet, frigid as the Arctic, with barely enough oxygen to sustain life, so lethal that hundreds have died trying to reach the top or trying to get back down again. But despite it all, there's the fatal attraction.
I remember the view. That was just the sunlight. Just about like 50 feet I can watch the summit of the Mount Everest, and it was like breathtaking, the view.
Shriya Shah first laid eyes on Mount Everest when she was a child in Nepal.
And I was thinking one day I will do that.
Decades later, living in Toronto, she announced to her friend Virginia Novak that at 33, she was going to rekindle that dream.
And she says, I'm climbing Mount Everest. And I says, have you lost your mind? And she says, no. She says, I've always wanted to do it.
Novak says Shriya was an irresistible force of nature herself.
One of the things about Shriya is that she believed in herself. She was a very confident woman. And that confidence was the one that drove her. She was a very driven person.
Born virtually in the shadow of Mount Everest, Shriya eventually traveled the world, working for cruise lines, which is how she met a Canadian named Bruce Chlorfine, who was the ship's pianist. He found her irresistible too.
She had a sweet look to her, that's what I can tell you. And her whole demeanor was like that. When I started to talk to her and got up enough guts to approach her, I thought there was something about the way she carried herself that was very nice.
They fell in love and married, returning to Canada to settle down. In Toronto, Shriya started a business, importing Indian foods and spices. She tried politics, representing a fringe party in the last federal election, winning just a few hundred votes. Bruce Chlorfine says whatever his wife did, it was with passion.
If she wanted something, there was nothing you could say to stop her.
Thank you.
But he was as shocked as anyone when she revealed she wanted to climb Mount Everest.
She just said, I'm going to the summit of Mount Everest.
And this came out of the blue to you?
Totally out of the blue. But from the time she told me about her plan, there was nothing that I could do to talk her out of it. And believe me, I tried.
Virginia Novak had no luck reasoning with her pal either.
And in her way, and she always did that, she would say, oh, just like a mother hen. I'm okay, don't worry, I'll be fine. She says, and then when we come back, we'll have a drink. Okay, that was it.
With less than a year until her planned climb in May 2012, there was no time to lose. To prepare, Shriya took hikes, not alpine exactly, in rural Ontario. She trained at a rock climbing gym. She lugged a weighted pack up the stairs of her 40-story Toronto high-rise. But without mountaineering equipment of her own, for publicity shots to raise awareness and money for her expedition, Shriya rented gear, then photoshopped herself in front of a picture of Mount Everest.
If successful, she will be the first South Asian woman from Canada to reach the top.
Her efforts soon attracted the attention of the local media.
Just can't wait to get there and just to raise Canada's flag. That's all I can see myself doing.
But to raise her flag on Everest, Shriya knew she would need help. The question was how much.
You have to find some good guides, the travel agency who knows already, who has knowledge, Sherpa who's going to be climbing, showing you the way.
In Nepal, Mount Everest is the single biggest tourist attraction, a major contributor to the country's GDP. Expeditions to Everest cost tens of thousands of dollars, and competition between guides and outfitters is fierce. Grayson Schaefer is a writer and editor for Outside Magazine.
It's just buyer beware. It's, you know, Everest is dangerous. You've got to basically take, you know, if you're going to try to climb Everest, you're taking your life into your hands. And so you'd better do your research on who you're going to pay to take you up the mountain.
But through family in Kathmandu, Shriya got an introduction to an expedition company. Utmost Adventure Trekking, it's called. Company manager Rishi Raj Kadel got the email from Canada.
Did she say an expedition
Yeah.
to Mount Everest?
Yeah, Mount Everest. I want to do this.
Last night we arrived here for about in the evening, and we slept all night. Now it's 7 o'clock local time, and we're ready to leave.
And once she reached Nepal, trekking to get acclimated to the altitude, the company didn't seem to think Shriya's inexperience was an issue.
Had she ever climbed a mountain before?
No, I think she never.
No.
She told me when
Had she ever been on an ice ladder, either horizontal or vertical?
No, never. She don't have no experience. She don't have nothing mountain experience.
So how on earth could you expect that she could make it up to the top of Mount
Okay,
Everest?
I talk with her. Every time she say, I can do it. I can do it. I can do it.
They told Shriya as long as she was determined enough, they'd teach her what she needed to know. Armed with that advice, she would set off for Mount Everest.
Our Canadian time is...
And she would keep a video diary of her fateful journey, as you'll see after the break.
We're ready to walk now for probably 8 hours, and we'll be the second spot, and we'll be resting for 1 day there. So there you go.
By the end of March 2012, Shriya Shah was in Kathmandu, capital of Nepal, her birthplace, and her home until her teens.
She's born here.
So you grew up together for a while?
Yeah.
For how long?
It's about, she was about 13 years we all together.
Sweta Raja is Shriya's cousin, though they always called each other sister. She says the family couldn't believe the one they teased for being lazy truly intended to climb the world's highest mountain.
She didn't love walking, you know. Whenever she came from out of house, she said, please call taxi. I'm not able to move. I'm not able to walk. You have to call taxi, otherwise I'm not willing to walk.
But now Shriya had hired that local company, Utmost Adventure Trekking, to guide her to the top of Mount Everest. But was that choice the right one?
Well, frankly, nobody had heard of Utmost Adventures. You know, when I talked to the owners and the outfitters, some of the biggest names, none of them had ever heard of Utmost.
Grayson Schaefer was embedded at base camp for the 2012 climbing season. He learned not only had Shriya never climbed, but that Utmost was a startup that hadn't guided anyone to Everest summit.
You had Sherpas who probably weren't actually qualified as guides, who were guiding a climber who had never climbed before, and those two things are just, you know, putting those two groups of people together is just it's a recipe for disaster.
Still, Shriya paid Utmost almost $40,000 to guide her, add travel, equipment, and tips for the Sherpas, the legendary Himalayan mountaineers who would help get her to the top, and the total cost could be closer to $80,000. But by early April, Shriya Shah was on her way to Mount Everest for a planned summit attempt in mid-May.
And time is...
And she would keep that video diary almost every step of the way.
Here you go. We're ready to walk now for like probably 8 hours, and we'll be the second spot, and we'll be resting for 1 day there.
From the foothills of the Himalayas here outside the Nepali capital of Kathmandu to Everest Base Camp is about 200 kilometers. A helicopter can get there in just over half an hour. But most climbers don't fly. Instead, they trek for up to 2 weeks because that's how their bodies acclimatize to the lack of oxygen they'll find when they get to the world's tallest mountain. But the closer they get to the summit of Everest, the less oxygen there is. At the very top, it's about a third of what we breathe at sea level. For many people who climb that mountain, it's not enough to keep them alive. It's why they call the upper reaches of Mount Everest the death zone. At Everest Base Camp, with the 2012 climbing season set to begin, there was an ominous feeling. Weather patterns essentially limit summit attempts on Mount Everest to late spring. But in 2012, climbing conditions were even more difficult than usual. What's more, there were worries about the sheer number of climbers waiting at base camp and the inexperience of some of them.
Everest is, certainly a very difficult endeavor, but it's not a very technical mountain. It doesn't require a lot of technical climbing skill. If you can just get yourself fit enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other, you can get up the thing.
Mountaineer and journalist Michael Kotis.
And consequently, lots of people with very little climbing experience show up on that mountain every year, and more and more of them every year.
Local time is 9:30. We're in the base camp. We're just below Mount Everest, where we're going to be going within a month.
This year, when Shriya Shah arrived at base camp, altitude 5,400 meters, or almost 18,000 feet, whatever she lacked in experience, she more than made up in swagger.
As you're coming into base camp, the kitchen tent for Utmost Adventures was right on the main trail, and across it was this giant sort of billboard of Ms. Shah in her 8,000 meter down suit, sort of smiling.
She had brought with her that photoshopped PR picture from Toronto, posing in her rented yellow climbing suit, now displayed in front of the real Mount Everest.
Initially, I had assumed that she was some sort of professional mountaineer and that this must have been, a big expedition that had a lot of funding.
That misimpression wouldn't last long. In training sessions, as you can see on this video from her own helmet cam, even going downhill, Shriya lagged far behind.
Hey, Kali!
But by all accounts, she was a willing student, liked by her teammates, and apparently not affected by the nausea or headaches caused by the altitude.
Was she slow?
She's slow also this moment also, more than other people's, okay?
We've been told that she was very slow.
Yeah. She's slow, that's everybody know.
Yeah.
That's, everybody know, she's slow. But she didn't have a headache.
Yeah.
She didn't have nothing, nothing. Just she continue walking,
In the business of leading expeditions on Everest, no one is better known or more respected than New Zealander Russell Bryce. In almost 4 decades, he's guided hundreds to the summit and earned a nickname, the Big Boss. His company, Himalayan Experience, had about 24 clients for Everest in 2012, who each paid over $50,000. But Russell Bryce had reason to worry.
I think this year was a very special year, and it was dangerous.
This spring, unusual weather conditions triggered avalanches and collapses of the massive slabs of ice known as seracs, making the fearsome Khumbu icefall even more dangerous.
That's a really deep crevasse.
How you do it?
Just for the viewers at home, I'm going to show everybody how deep that thing is. It's pretty deep. Pretty deep.
In early May, one huge serac demolished a high-altitude camp just before dozens of Russell Bryce's climbers were due to arrive at it.
When the Serac fall collapsed at Camp 3, and there was, 18 tents crushed. 6 hours later, those tents would have been full of people. So that would have been, 32 people killed.
At best, it meant the 2012 climbing season was shortened dramatically. With monsoon rains due by June, the window for a summit ascent would now be open for no more than a couple of weeks, and no sooner than mid-May. The mishaps were making climbers even more edgy.
There was an avalanche that knocked out our entire camp from up there, so I just went up and did a load. Took a load of gear from Jangbu. We were digging some stuff out, like tents and stoves and food and gear that we had cached up here.
So essentially a whole year's contingent of climbers now waited at base camp. Hundreds poised to try for the top at the earliest opportunity. The question for everyone, when would that be? But for Shriya Shah, there was another question. Should she even be on Mount Everest in the first place?
Oh, okay.
She had to be taught almost everything, from putting crampons on her boots to how to use them to cross the ice ladders.
Okay.
Like this.
Got you.
But as the day to summit approached, the senior Sherpa for Utmost Adventures apparently changed his mind about guiding Shriya. She phoned her cousin Sweta to say he had bluntly warned her not to climb.
If you walk on this way, you will die and you will kill us too.
He literally said,
Yeah.
if you go on, well,
You will also die and you will kill us too.
When we come back, despite the doubts and against all odds, Shriya's dream is about to come true.
That's amazing determination from her.
It was 7:30 p.m. on May the 18th, and Shriya Shah was about to undertake what no one but she thought possible, to attempt to summit Mount Everest. From Camp 4 at 8,000 meters, it is just half a mile straight up to the highest point on the face of the Earth. Even for the best, the trip to the summit and back can be 10 to 12 hours of intense climbing, all in the oxygen-starved death zone. But as inexperienced as she was, when Shriya set out for the summit, she wasn't accompanied by the top guides from Utmost Adventures. Instead, the owner of the company, Ganesh Thakuri, would go on ahead, as would the senior Sherpa, who told Shriya she could die. They both left her their most vulnerable client, with two less experienced Sherpas. Even with supplemental oxygen, the climb would be ponderously difficult and slow. Adventure journalist Grayson Schaefer.
They will be taking one or two steps, stopping, taking a few breaths, and then continuing, taking another step. So if you can imagine, walking 10 feet in, 2 or 3 minutes, it's so slow.
And Shriya was among the slowest. On May 18th, 2012, that was saying something. This photograph, taken by a German climber, would come to symbolize the commercialization of a natural wonder, the throng waiting to summit as if lined up at an amusement park.
I'm looking at that picture and going, has everyone lost their head? Is there no one there that is actually thinking whatsoever that, hey, we need some distance between people?
Veteran guide Russell Bryce says incredibly, those hundreds of climbers depended on one rope line, which could break at any moment, hurling them down the sheer ice face. One rockfall or collapsing serac could kill dozens. and the inevitable delays would be lethal too.
When you have that determination of that they have to get to the summit, and it's so close, but it's still so far away. And so there I can see that people are going to start running out of oxygen.
But none of Russell Bryce's clients were in that line, because 2 weeks earlier, he had taken the extraordinary step of canceling his expedition, telling dozens of climbers who'd paid over $50,000 apiece the situation was simply too dangerous. A controversial decision with no refunds.
It's hard to lay blame on any particular one thing, but it's all these small contributing things that escalate to that summit day that made it such a powerful day this year.
On summit day, their headlamps eerily lit the top of the ridge as Shriya and her Sherpas climbed all night. By 11:30 on the morning of May 19th, they'd been ascending for 16 hours straight. She frequently had to sit down and rest. In many places, the trail to the top of Mount Everest is wide enough only for a single person, whether it's a ladder over a crevasse in the icefall or a towering ridge with sheer drops on both sides. There's often no place to pass. You can only go as fast as the climber in front of you. And nowhere is that more so than at the last major obstacle before the summit, known as the Hillary Step, a 15-meter wall of rock and ice with a single rope line for those going up and down. On May 19th, the wait in each direction was 2 hours long. It was there that something happened which may well have been the most important moment of Shriya Shah's life. Remember, the utmost owner had decided to go on ahead in his own quest for the summit. He's here, on the right, passing a seemingly exhausted Shriya. But later, returning from the top, he again came face to face with Shriya, now almost out of oxygen.
They told me she have only 20 minutes left oxygen. 20 minutes left. Right. She don't have any more oxygen after this.
Owner Ganesh Takuri says he knew it was now much too late for Shriya and the Sherpas to continue up to the summit.
They can reach to summit around 2:30 after that, and it means really, dangerous.
He says he tried to convince her to turn around.
Even we say you cannot go, you have to go down strongly, then she says no, I spend money and my goal is to reach to summit. And then, anyhow I will go. So in this case, we cannot do anything.
So with Shriya Shah's life at stake, the utmost owner gave her one last bottle of oxygen. Then he left her again, headed down. Shriya and her two Sherpas kept waiting to go up.
I understand there was a traffic jam, but that doesn't change the fact that if she gets to the summit at 2:30, she will have been already climbing for 19 hours.
19 hours, yeah.
She's already almost out of oxygen.
Yeah.
And she's going to have to make her way back down in the dark.
Yeah.
Isn't that your company's responsibility to make sure she's not in that position?
The expedition manager claims from base camp he tried everything he could to get the Sherpas to turn Shriya around.
Back to Sherpa, I talked with them also to why you don't bring back her. Why you guys going to with her to top? They told me, if you guys want to go back, you can go back. I'm going to top. They told me like this.
How would you look upon the logistics of that arrangement?
It's totally ridiculous. It's the first time I've heard the times of that, and that's just totally ridiculous.
Why?
Well, the owner should have turned her around, and then the owner should have stayed there and made sure she came back.
Russell Bryce maintains that saving lives is really the only job an expedition leader has.
I know it's hard. We've had to do it. It's an incredibly difficult situation to be in.
But before long, something remarkable would happen on Everest summit. She had never climbed before. She was among the slowest on the mountain. Her guides repeatedly warned her to turn back. But amazingly, just before 2:30 on a brilliant afternoon, Shriya Shah realized her dream and reached the summit of Mount Everest, 8,848 meters above sea level, 29,028 feet. At this moment, no one on Earth stood closer to the sun. And within minutes, the word began to spread.
At 5:30, I woke up, and something told me to go to the computer. And I went to the computer, and it already started saying that Shriya has climbed the summit. And I was just elated. Now, I can't go back to sleep, so I'm emailing all my friends and everybody that knows her that Shriya has successfully climbed Mount Everest. And I says, now, the trek is for her to come down safely.
Finally, Shriya's husband, Bruce Klorfine, could breathe a sigh of relief.
I was excited for her, you know. I just felt proud. I mean, for me, that overshadowed the sense of danger that I had about the whole thing, or whatever I was worried about. I thought, if she could accomplish that, then, you know, she must be able to get back down as well.
But Russell Bryce believes that even at this triumphant moment, Shriya was already past the point of no return.
You know, that's amazing determination from her. She must have been cold, although the photo of her on the summit, she doesn't look that cold. But she must have been cold. Amazing determination, but absolutely stupid. But without any direction and anyone to say, come back.
In the blinding sun, but still at far below zero, she spent almost half an hour savoring the moment. There seems no sense of urgency here, even with her dwindling oxygen supply.
They should have known that she was almost out of oxygen. Did they mention that to you? Did they tell you that?
No, they don't tell me.
Why not? Why wouldn't they?
I don't know. They don't tell me this, we are on the way back.
Just before 3 p.m., Shriya and the Sherpas started back down. When we returned, one of Mount Everest's darkest days.
We had the sense that we were really not climbing a mountain, but really, you know, just seeing one horrible moment after another.
It was just before 3 p.m. on May the 19th when Shriya Shah left the summit of Mount Everest, headed in the only possible direction, down. Not only were there dangerously few hours of daylight left, but worse, the weather was about to dramatically change. Winds increasing that evening to close to hurricane force, temperatures plummeting to -40.
By the time Shriya began her descent, it was already mid-afternoon on May the 19th. She had been climbing for 20 hours straight. After the adrenaline rush at the summit, by now, her feeling of fatigue must have been overwhelming.
So here we are at Camp 4, death zone, 7,900 meters.
Rounded up to 8, we're at 8,000 meters.
8,000 meters.
Oh, wait.
Half a vertical mile below at Camp 4, two other climbers were about to begin their summit push. Sandra Leduc of Ottawa is a lawyer with Canada's Department of Justice. John Kudrowski from Colorado, a PhD in environmental geography. Just after dusk, Kudrowski took this photograph showing climbers on the mountain above. He first assumed they were summiters going up, then realized they were actually coming down after what must have been already more than a day in the death zone.
And definitively, what's the implication of that to you?
So as soon as I saw that happening, and then that's why I did snap the photo, was I said to myself, this isn't good. Like, why are people up there that long?
As Sandra Leduc and John Kudrowski left for the summit, Everest's death zone was about to live up to its name. Leduc says what they saw next was like a morgue.
We had this sense that we were really in, not climbing a mountain, but really, you know, just seeing one horrible moment after another.
Within an hour, there was the first body, a fellow climber hooked to the rope line. Kudrowski says he couldn't tell if he was still alive, but that he was obviously beyond help.
If you believed that person were still breathing, what could you have done?
Alone, honestly, not much. You could try to pick them up and drag them, but then it physically exerts you so bad that you can't. There's really nothing you can do. You got to have people around you to help pick the person up, you know. And so that was kind of why I, just kept going up.
In all that night, he had to step around 3 climbers on the line who were dead or dying. Then he abandoned his own summit attempt to help others in desperate need to descend. Several hundred meters above, the 2 Sherpas had kept pushing Shriya, physically and verbally. Themba Sherpa says he used the Nepalese word Didi, which means big sister.
हामीलाई केसम्म हुन्थ्यो भने हामीले हाम्रो मुखमा यति मात्रै आउँथ्यो कि हिन्नु दिदी हिन्नु दिदी हिन्नु सिरा दिदी हिन्नु सिरा दिदी हिन्नु सिरा दिदी हिन्नु सिरा दिदी चाहिँ हाम्रो एकदम तपाईको छेडछेडमै पीर परिसक्यो अब रात परिसकेको थियो पीर चाहिँ अति धेरै पीर भइसकेको थियो.
It was now 7 hours since they'd left the summit, 27 consecutive hours of climbing in the death zone.
Once you get above 8,000 meters, it's the closest thing to being in outer space. The lack of oxygen itself just completely trashes your body. Your body starts to basically, what they say is consume itself, is uses so much energy that you do have left over to function that it just can't even survive very much longer than 20 hours.
I've read comments from people who say things like Sherpas, can just strap you on their back and carry you, and that's completely false. I challenge anyone, again, who says that to go to Everest and see it for themselves.
Shriya and the Sherpas now began to encounter that next wave of climbers heading up. Shriya pleaded for help from the passers-by. "Please don't let me die," she said. Her Sherpas, nearing exhaustion themselves, struggled to keep her on her feet.
उड्नु भन्दाखेरि तपाईको दुईजनाले समायो भने उहाँ जिउ चाहिँ ठिङ्ग्रिएर चाहिँ बस्न सक्नुहुन्थ्यो. अब एकछिन चाहिँ अब त्यो तर खुट्टा चलेकै त्यो लडी प्यारालाइज भएको जस्तो नै भइसक्यो त्यो लगभग.
Remember, Shriya had got that last oxygen bottle at the Hillary Step that morning, about 11 hours earlier.
How long would that oxygen likely last?
Probably about 4 hours.
According to veteran guide Russell Bryce, she'd been given enough to go up, but not to come back down.
So she would have been well running out of oxygen.
By the time she got back to the Hillary, bottom of the Hillary Step again, by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
So she probably had to go from probably South Summit to the balcony without oxygen.
According to the Sherpas, it was after 10 p.m. when Shriya stopped moving and speaking altogether. High on the ledge known as the balcony, at about 8,400 meters, or 27,600 feet, they secured her climbing apparatus to the rope line, and then they left her there, among the hundreds of other climbers from the history of Mount Everest whose frozen bodies remain in the death zone. Not long afterwards, another Sherpa named Pemba Jangbu was on his way up when he saw someone who obviously needed help.
His dress in the down suit is from Canadian flag.
It's
red and white.
Red and white
Yeah.
design of the flag.
Yeah.
So you recognize
Yeah.
that as the Canadian.
Yeah.
And Pemba recognized the woman whose picture he had seen at base camp, the Canadian born in Nepal. He too spoke to her using the Nepali word for big sister.
Yeah, I call Sis like a Nepali. I told him Didi Didi. I told it 3 times, 4 times.
Then, suddenly, unexpectedly, Shriya seemed to try to say something.
Like sound is maybe I listening sound
She
that kind
spoke
of.
to you?
Not spoke, but like I just sound.
He says he attempted to revive her, but it was too late.
And after I take out water and oxygen, but after I calling 4 times, she didn't respond to me.
When he realized Shriya was no longer breathing, Pemba took this picture. Then he left, looking for others who needed help. That night, there was no shortage.
Once a client is beyond the point of rescue, a Sherpa, a guide, anybody has to be able to save themselves. And to say that somebody was actually abandoned versus they were beyond help is a difficult thing that you can't say if you don't have firsthand knowledge of it.
The following day, Shriya's Sherpas radioed the awful news to base camp. Shriya's cousin, Sweta.
Just till the time we didn't get the news that there is the body, we had expecting she is still alive. So I stopped. And then she told that it's not possible. He told me that it's not possible. It's about, because the dress she have make is in different color from other climber, and there's the Canadian flag too. So it's belonged to her.
Shriya's body would remain above 8,000 meters for 10 days, until a rescue party managed to return to the death zone and carry her back down.
नेपाली मूलकी क्यानेडियन महिला श्रेया शाहको नाश थियो।
Shriya Shah was cremated in Kathmandu. According to Hindu tradition, her husband lit the funeral pyre. Bruce Chlorfine says he now accepts that his wife had been searching for something on Mount Everest.
If she accomplished that, it would change the way she feels about herself. I mean, she would always have that sort of notch in her belt. And it's a huge thing. It's something that everybody relates to.
And ultimately, he knows this worst of endings was brought about in some important part by what was best in Shriya.
It's amazing when I think back to her telling me that she wants to do it, to her actually doing it. I mean, I'm floored. Like, how can, you know, I would have never thought it possible, but I did come to respect the determination, and I knew that there was some substance to it.
When we come back.
When people die on Everest, there's no negative consequence for the Nepalese government, for the bureaucrats. They make the same amount of money either way.
Shriya Shah was one of 10 climbers who didn't return alive from Mount Everest this season, the third worst death toll in history, which raises some fundamental questions. If this so-called traffic jam on May 18th contributed to the carnage, how might another one be avoided? Should the number of climbers on Everest be limited? Should novices like Shriya be refused access altogether? In a country where the average Nepali earns less than $700 a year, Mount Everest generates annual revenue of almost $100 million. Still, government officials said they couldn't answer our questions because they hadn't considered them before. That doesn't surprise Grayson Schaefer of Outside Magazine.
For them to suddenly limit the number of climbing permits that they're willing to issue would just be like shooting themselves in the foot. When people die on Everest, there's no negative consequence for the Nepalese government, for the bureaucrats. They make the same amount of money either way, and the more people that die on Everest, the more people who want to try Everest.
The guide known as Everest's big boss, Russell Bryce, who canceled his expedition this year, believes all Everest companies must put saving lives ahead of getting to the top.
Part of our problem over the years is we've become too successful. And it looks as though it's almost automatic that people can get to the summit of the mountain. But it's not true. It can come back and bite you. And that's what it did this year.
It's almost 8 p.m. here in the South Col. About to head up Everest. Can't wait to get up there. It's going to be a great year.
As for Sandra Leduc and John Kudrowski, just days after their experience with life and death on Everest, they did something remarkable too. Together, they climbed back into the death zone, and this time made it to the summit. Both ascending and descending, they had to pass Shriya Shah.
The first moment when I went up and I saw the Canadian flag, I felt sick. And then when I came down, then I wanted to cry. And so I didn't know the connection. I didn't know anything about her then, but I was already just thinking about, her family, because I could have, if it had been me, I know how my family would have felt. It was hard because she's a real person. She had people who cared about her and who are going to be dealing with this, for the rest of their lives.
So what will be Shriya Shah's legacy? Will her story bring change on Mount Everest? Or will it be just one story of many more to come?
I think unless the Nepalese government comes to its senses and decides that they're either going to limit the number of climbers or somehow put restrictions, prerequisites for climbers who want to try the mountain, that this is actually the new normal. That from here on out, every year there will be a sort of slow bloodletting of people who probably shouldn't be there, who go anyway, who don't listen to reason, and who, end up walking until they die.
As you might imagine, it was very difficult for some of the people you just heard to speak candidly about Shriya so soon after her death. I'd like to thank her friends and family for their generosity in sharing their experiences.
Yeah!